Greetings to all and welcome to this new session of the Islamic History and Thought lecture series. I would like to begin with a reminder that the previous lectures of the series have been recorded and are available on the IIS YouTube channel. So today I have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Roy Vilozny, who is a senior lecturer at the Department of Arabic Language and Literature of the University of Haifa. Dr. Vilozny specializes in the Imami-Shiʿi literature of the medieval period, with a particular focus on the Shi'i Hadith literature of the 9th and 10th centuries. Dr. Vilozny has published several articles on these topics, most recently Transmitting Imami Hadith, Preserving Knowledge, remarks on 3 Amali works of the Buwayhid period, which was published in the Jerusalem Studies in Arabic and Islam in 2021. And he has also published a book, Constructing a Worldview, Al-Barqi's Role in the Making of Early Shi'i Faith, published in 2017. So the lecture will last for about 40 minutes and will be followed by a discussion with Dr. Edmund Hayes and myself. So Dr. Hayes is a postdoctoral researcher in history at Radboud University in the Netherlands. Also an expert of early Imami Shi'ism with an interest in the intellectual, religious and social history of early Islam. Dr. Hayes has published a number of articles on these topics. His recently published articles include the institutions of the Shi'i Imamate towards a social history of early Imami Shi'ism, which was published in Al-Masaq in 2021. And in 2021 as well, he co-edited, along with Dr. Rodrigo Adem, an important volume entitled Reason, Esotericism and Authority in Shi'i Islam. And more recently, in January of this year, he published his book, Agents of the Hidden Imam, Forging 12-Verse Shi'ism, which Cambridge University Press, a book of which he gave us a preview in this very lecture series in April 2021. So for those who are interested, the recording of this session is online. So after the lecture and discussion, I will open the floor to questions from the audience, both online and in person. I encourage the public online to send their questions in writing through the Q&A option at the bottom of the control panel. And as time allows, I will convey them to the speaker. I will now give the floor to Dr. Roy Vilozny. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good evening. And I thank you all for your attendance, both here at the IIS and online. Before I begin, I would like to thank Fârès Gillon for his kind invitation to share with you tonight some aspects of my current work on Shi'i intellectual history. I would equally like to thank Ed, who accepted the invitation to be our discussant tonight, as well as the Institute of Ismaili Studies for initiating and supporting the Islamic History and Thought lecture series, as well as for the warm hospitality. The title of my lecture, you may have noticed, comprises 2 elements. You just arrived on time. So, the title of my lecture, you may have noticed, comprises 2 elements. One is rather universal and refers to the term myth and to the notion of pre-existence, and the other, to which the bulk of this talk will be devoted, is more specific and concerns the manners in which the mythic building blocks of the notion of pre-existence, a central theme in the literatures of various manifestations of Shi'ism, were developed, utilized, interpreted, and elaborated upon by Imami-Shi'i thinkers. Before I get to the subject itself, 3 preliminary methodological remarks may be useful. First, my choice to use the term myth to describe some recurrent narratives in Shi'i literature, including those concerned with pre-existence, is derived from both the conviction that Shi'i sources are replete with mythic materials, as well as from the hope that the application of this term in the field of Shi'i studies will help us to evaluate Shi'ism from fresh, new, less familiar angles. Second, I am aware of the complexity of the term myth and propose that for the sake of tonight's lecture, we would adhere to a rather simple definition, namely that a myth is a sacred story a community tells itself in order to explain how the world and men have reached their present state. And finally, a word on pre-existence. By this term, I'm referring to the idea that prior to the creation of the physical world and of the first man, a series of events of far-reaching consequences had taken place. Resorting to a mythic pre-existential era in order to provide an explanation for the human condition or experience in this world is familiar since antiquity. Alongside various ancient Near Eastern civilizations, such as the Mesopotamian, the Akkadian, the Hebrew, and the Zoroastrian, in whose sources we find allusions to pre-existential events, one cannot not mention the Greeks and above all Plato. Despite numerous deviations and intellectual developments since Plato's time, the 4th century BCE, he is still considered responsible for laying the ideological foundations of both Occidental and Oriental thought. Of most relevance for our discussion is Plato's notion of a pre-existent realm of souls, first mentioned in Meno and then further developed in Phaedo, which he sees as the source of human knowledge, especially that of abstract principles and ideas. Knowledge which is acquired in this world through recollection, anamnesis of that pre-existential realm. This idea was later adopted and adapted by Christian theologians and Gnostics and circulated extensively in the early Christian world, at least until the middle of the 6th century CE, when Emperor Justinian decided to include it in his list of 10 anathemas against Origen, the church father to whom the introduction of the idea of pre-existence into Christian thought is attributed. This is not the place to trace in detail the different channels through which Plato's ideas reached Islamic thought, but I would like nevertheless to briefly mention the enormous influence on medieval Muslim thinkers of another Greek philosopher. I mean, of course, Plotinus. Active in the 3rd century CE and known as the father of Neoplatonism, Plotinus modified in his Enneads, edited and published by his disciple Porphyry of Tyre, the Platonic notion of pre-existence in general and of the soul's pre-existence in particular, and developed it into a triangular, full-blown cosmology of the one, the intellect, and the soul. As is by now well known, an Arabic paraphrased version of 3 of these Enneads, the 4th on the soul, the 5th on the intelligible world, and the 6th on the one that discussed metaphysics, became exceptionally popular among medieval Muslim, Jewish, and Christian thinkers under the erroneous title, The Theology of Aristotle. Echoes of the cosmology of Plotinus, including its Platonic foundations, are thus to be found in the works of numerous medieval Islamic writers of a wide range of intellectual traditions, mostly philosophers and mystics, but as we shall soon observe, and as was noted by Ignaz Goldziher as early as 1909, also in the most ancient layer of Imami-Shiʿi literature, the Hadith ascribed to the Prophet and the Imams. Among the multiple expressions of the notion of pre-existence in Shi'i thought, I would like to concentrate today on the idea that the souls were created before the bodies, and that the soul's experience in the realm that preceded the creation of the world and of man had been decisive for the human condition in the created world. Furthermore, since according to Islam, conduct in this world determines one's fate in the afterlife, and since conduct in this world depends to a great extent on pre-existential factors, it was inevitable that the latter would also be seen as crucial with respect to the world to come. In the first part of my talk, I will refer to the Quranic nucleus around which the notion of the soul's pre-existence developed, and then move on to describe the further elaboration of this idea in the literature of Hadith. In the second part, I will show the profound change of attitude in the Buwayhid period that is from 945 until 1055 CE, towards the raw materials that deal with the idea of pre-existence, that is the Quran and the Hadith. And lastly, I will try to give you a glimpse of the approach of 2 or 3 scholars of the Safavid era, 1501 to 1722 CE, to the very same materials. When one reads through early Shi'i sources, and by early I mean the extant compilations of Hadith, the oldest of which go back to the 9th century CE, the impression gained is that pre-existence is a prominent theme therein. As any prominent theme in the sayings attributed to the Prophet and the Imams, pre-existence too is depicted as something to which God refers, even if only elusively, in the Quran. The Imams, in turn, who according to Shi'i belief are endowed with the capability and required knowledge to shed light on God's word and disperse the ambiguity that surrounds it, further elaborate on the subject. That being said, the gap between the meager Quranic references to the notion of pre-existence in general and of pre-existential human agency in the form of souls in particular, and between the rich information provided by the Imams in this regard, is nevertheless striking. Professor Uri Rubin of Tel Aviv University, who sadly passed away recently, examined in 2015 this gap in the context of the Prophet Muhammad. Rubin showed that in contrast to post-Quranic sources that are rich in depictions of Muhammad's pre-existence, the Quran itself includes only one verse, 26, Shu'ara, verse 219, that could, not without some creativity, be understood as alluding to this notion. This is due to the expression وَتَقَلُّبَكَ فِي السَّاجِدِينَ, which Arbery, as well as others, translate as something quite remote from any allusion to some existential mythic concept as "and when thou turnest about among those who bow." In addition, Rubin rightly argues the notion of pre-existence emerges in the Quran in 3 main contexts. First, the Quran itself, whose source is said to be Kitab, Quran 1339, or Kitab Maknoon, Quran 5678, or Al-Lawh al-Mahfuz, Quran 85, 21, 22. Second, Al-Kaaba, referred to in the Quran as Awwal Bayt, in Quran 396. And finally, of most relevance to our discussion, a primordial contract that God had made with prophets as well as with mankind at large. This is mentioned in Quran 381, 7, 172, and Quran 33, 7. As mentioned earlier, I would like to focus today on the idea that the creation of the souls, al-arwah, took place long before the creation of the bodies. The most relevant Quranic verse around which this narrative in Shi'i tradition evolves is Quran 7, 172, Al-A'raf 172, known as the covenant verse, although, by the way, the word covenant, mithaq, is not mentioned in it. I will read Abdul Halim's translation. When your Lord took out the offspring from the loins of the children of Adam and made them bear witness about themselves, he said, "Am I not your Lord?" And they replied, "Yes, we bear witness. So you cannot say on the day of resurrection, we were not aware of this." Unquote. As you can see, there is no explicit or implicit mention of souls nor of pre-existence in the sense to which I referred in the introduction. That is, a time prior to the creation of the world and of the first man. The verse clearly describes a dramatic event whose consequences stretch from the time of its occurrence until the day of resurrection. Yet the setting seems to be posterior to the creation of the world, of Adam, and probably also to the creation of Adam's children, from whose loins their offspring is taken. These impressions, by the way, are supported by the previous verses that allude to God's covenant with the children of Israel at Mount Sinai. In other words, verse 172 could be seen as pushing the notion of covenant further backwards to the dawn of human history, to the time of Adam or Adam's children. An examination of At-Tabari's commentary on this verse, and as you may well know, his commentary gives us a fair overview of the exegetical opinions prevalent within the Islamic Sunni community until the late 9th, early 10th century CE, corroborates these impressions. First, there is a consensus among commentators that the event of the covenant took place after the creation of Adam. Second, several accounts specify that it took place following Adam's descent to earth, either in Na'man, a wadi in the vicinity of Mount Arafah, near Mecca, or at the Dajni area of India. 3. As to the entities with whom the covenant had been done, most versions refer, not without connection to the word dhurriya in the Quranic verse, to dhar, that is, particles, seeds, something as small as ants, and at any rate, something more tangible than spirit or soul. According to only one account, the pact was convened between God and the souls prior to the creation of the bodies. There is also an agreement that God took from Adam's loins the dhar, or seeds, of every person, every nasama, that was to be created until the day of resurrection. The destiny of all future human beings was determined on this occasion, including who, despite the covenant, will end up in hell, who will enter paradise, and the lifespan of every individual. Some commentators also allude to the concept of fitra, mentioned in Quran 30:30, as the natural disposition God instilled in mankind, as resulting from the fact that the seeds, or dhar, of all human beings were present on this occasion, and therefore none is born without its traces. In conclusion, although posterior to Adam's creation, the general idea that emerges from At-Tabari's commentary on this verse is nevertheless of a primordial event that was to determine humanity's future. This narrative, it could be justly argued, is a variation on the classical myth of pre-existence, transferring the setting of the event into the created world and stressing the universal genealogical aspect, namely, all human beings are of Adam's progeny, all human beings bear in them the potential to be God-fearing. When we look at the earliest layer of Shi'i literature that revolves around the covenant verse, that is, the traditions ascribed to the Imams, either in thematic Hadith compilations or in Quran commentaries by scholars active more or less in Al-Tabari's time, that is the 9th, 10th centuries CE, the feeling is of entering a slightly different territory. In what way is it different? This is a big question, and I'm only at the beginning of an attempt to map this territory, but a preliminary examination brings to the fore several basic aspects. First, with regard to time, Imami traditions clearly set the covenant event in a pre-existential era, that is, prior to the creation of the world and of the first man. The recurring phrasing being, God created the souls of our Shia 2,000 years prior to the creation of their bodies. Second, this phrasing clearly associates the covenant with the souls of the future Shi'i believers rather than with a more tangible element such as the seed taken from Adam's loins. And third, as you may have also noticed in this phrasing, the stress in traditions revolving around this event is on the Shi'i community rather than on humanity as a whole. In consequence, many traditions specify that the covenant included not only acknowledgement of God, but also of Muhammad's prophethood and of Ali's walaya, the three essential components of the Shi'i core belief. And lastly, with regard to the location of the event, the impression is that it is seen as extraterrestrial, in a spiritual rather than geographical space. Moreover, several traditions refer to this space as another world, either as the world of the dhar, the world of the shadows, al-adhilla, or that of silhouettes of light, ashbah nur. We are thus introduced to a whole new concept, a world of different nature in which the souls of future human beings are dwelling. These are only some basic observations. The picture is much more complex, but I would like to leave enough time to move from the myth itself to its implications. And by implications, at least in today's lecture, I mean the difficulties and problematics that this myth raised within the Shi'i scholarly discourse. In fact, traces of the difficulties raised by this myth are to be found in the strata of the Hadith itself. Several fundamental questions are integrated into the same traditions that promote this myth. For example, a disciple is said to have asked the sixth Imam, Ja'far as-Sadiq, how could the Dhar answer God on his question, Alastu bi Rabbikum, am I not your Lord? And the Imam replied, God made in them, that is, in the Dhar, that which enabled them to answer when he asked them. This seems to be as a secondary question of the more general one. What exactly did Dhar wear on the occasion of the covenant? On which Imam Sadiq is said to have replied, God made of them what was sufficient for him for this occasion. Another question that preoccupied the disciples of the Imams was whether the covenant event included the vision of God, Mu'ayana, on which Imam Sadiq confirms but clarifies that while the participants forgot the event itself, and of course also the vision of God, they maintained the acknowledgement of God. These reservations or carries, however, seem to serve as a means to bolster the narrative rather than to criticize it. They are presented as questions addressed at the Imam, who resolves them one by one, and by so doing he gives the narrative its final shape. Moreover, these questions are rather naive and remain within the mythic realm. They do not, as we will see in later Shi'i literature, question its very foundations. Following the period of the historical Imams, that is, after the 12th Imam's occultation in 940 CE, the Qur'an and the Hadith remained the source references of any doctrinal or ideological development. Even exceptionally critic scholars still felt committed to articulate their views in reference to these two sources. In this context, one of the prevailing theses in the field of Shi'i studies, to whose crystallization several scholars such as Madelung, Kohlberg, and Barasher have contributed, and which has been repeatedly promoted and emphasized by Professor Muhammad Ali Amir Moizzi, is worthy of note. According to this thesis, the Buwayhid period, which happened to coincide with the onset of the 12th Imam's greater occultation, constituted a foundational turning point in Shi'i thought. In a nutshell, in many aspects of faith, one can observe from this period onwards a gradual transition from esoteric, mythic, and even magic conceptions to a more rationalistic, legalistic attitude. The marks of this transformation are also traceable in scholars' approach towards pre-existence. Post-occultation scholars, who were no longer at ease with certain mythic, esoteric messages the Qur'an and the Hadith convey, had to find a way to reconcile their commitment to these sacred sources with a more rationalistic approach. To demonstrate how this process affected the notion of the soul's pre-existence, I will refer to a famous dispute between a rather conservative teacher and his rationalist disciple during the Buwayhid period. The one between Ibn Babawayhi, known as Shaykh al-Saduq, died in 991 CE, and Shaykh al-Mufid, his disciple, who died a few decades after his teacher in 1022 CE. In a treatise whose purpose was to define the Imami-Shi'i articles of faith, titled I'tiqadat al-Imamiyya, al-Saduq devotes a chapter to the belief in spirits and souls, al-i'tiqad fi nufus wal-arwah. Al-Saduq's presentation of the Imami belief regarding the souls is based primarily on Quranic verses and traditions by the Prophet and the Imams, from which he arrives at the following conclusion, whose resemblance, by the way, to the section on the soul in the aforementioned The Theology of Aristotle is noteworthy. The spirits, al-nufus, are the same as the souls, al-arwah. They are the source of life, bi al-hayat, which is reminiscent of the Greek anima, and they are, pay attention, God's first creation, al-khalq al-awwal, to which he granted speaking ability to confess his unity, and only later did he create the rest of his creation. In addition, as-Saduq states that the souls were created for eternity and not for a limited time, that they are alien on earth, أنها في الأرض غريبة, imprisoned in the bodies. When they depart from the bodies, they do not cease to exist. Rather, some of them are tortured, while others are in pleasant conditions until God brings them back into their bodies, that is, at the resurrection. As you see, the basic myth of pre-existence, according to which the souls were created long before the bodies and are in fact independent entities, is preserved. In a harsh critique of as-Saduq's formulation of many of the Imami-Shiʿi articles of faith, titled Tasḥīḥ al-I'tiqād, Shaykh al-Mufid, known as the precursor of the Imamiyya's adoption of rationalistic thought and kalam, literally demythologizes his teacher's perception of the souls. According to him, rather than in-depth investigation, as-Saduq resorted to conjecture. Had as-Saduq only cited the relevant hadiths, says al-Mufid, and not attempted to offer his view as to their meaning, he would not have found himself dealing with a subject matter that is far beyond his capability. According to al-Mufid, as-Saduq's view that the souls were created 2,000 years prior to the bodies, and that the souls even knew each other in that era, is first of all based on hadiths whose provenance is dubious, min ahadith al-ahad. Second, this account, unlike what those who do not possess knowledge of the truths of things, haqa'iq al-ashya, think, is about the angels rather than the souls. It is not at all, al-Mufid stresses, what those who believe in metempsychosis or transmigration of the soul, tanasukh, think. The latter, he adds, have unfortunately influenced those Shi'is who adhered to the hadith too blindly, al-Hashwiyah, and who therefore believe that the souls are the active essences, al-Dhawat al-Fa'ala, on which it is commanded and forbidden, and that they were created in the world of the Dhar. In that world, according to their wrong belief, the souls were introduced to each other and had cognitive and communicative capacities. In Arabic, تتعارفوا وتعقلوا وتفهموا وتنطقوا. Only much later, al-Mufid goes on to describe their misconception. Did God create bodies for the souls and install them in them? Had that been the case, says al-Mufid, we would have known what we went through, especially if we were reminded of it. Just as if someone who lived for some time in a city would never forget it. It would have been interesting, by the way, to hear al-Mufid's opinion on 3 chapters of Basair al-Darajat by the pre-Buwayhid traditionist Safar al-Qummi, died in 902 CE, in which the Prophet Muhammad, Ali ibn Abi Talib, and the Imams share in great detail their memories of the pre-existential covenant. This text, however, perhaps due to the above-mentioned ideological transformation of the Buwayhid era, never made it to al-Mufid's library. Finally, al-Mufid concludes, although as-Saduq was unaware of it, his statement regarding the belief in the souls is the view of the metempsychosists, at-Tanasukhiyya, and this is a great sin, jinaya azima. Al-Mufid, so it seems, was not a great admirer of Plato, but he was not the only one who confused the soul's pre-existence with metempsychosis. In another treatise, titled Al-Masail al-Sarawiyya, al-Mufid offers his own explanation to the covenant verse. According to him, among the many different hadiths regarding this verse, the correct one has it that God took out the offspring of Adam from his loins as small particles, dhar, and filled with them the visible horizons. This was done for the purpose of showing Adam God's potence and providing him with knowledge regarding the future of his progeny. The idea is reminiscent of Genesis 22:17, where following the binding of Isaac, God promises Abraham that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky, and as the sand on the seashore. Al-Mufid is not clear about the exact state of the dhar and suggests to understand it as spiritless essences of the bodies of Adam's offspring. Usul ajsam dhurriyatihi duna arwahihim. At any rate, it is clear that in his view the dhar had no active role whatsoever. If due to the literal sense of the Quranic verse, the covenant verse, someone still insists that the offspring of Adam were at this stage living, speaking entities, Al-Mufid offers the following argument. This verse is to be understood metaphorically, namely, that God makes a covenant with every mukallaf of Adam's offspring in every generation, that is, with every sane in mind who is obliged to observe the precepts of religion, mukallaf. How is this covenant being done with every mukallaf? This is achieved by providing each individual with reason, intelligence, aql, and sufficient evidence within the created world to reach the basic conclusion that he or she are created and that their creator is one and unique and merits worship. Similar explanations are to be found in Quran commentaries by Al-Mufid's more or less contemporaries, such as At-Tusi's At-Tibyan fi Tafsir al-Qur'an and the Tabrisi's Majma' al-Bayan fi Tafsir al-Qur'an. One can observe that alongside a different kind of myth, that of the divine spreading of Adam's offspring as dhar all over the horizons, which Al-Mufid is willing to accept as valid interpretation of the covenant verse, he offers a pure rational way to understand it. If I was asked which of the two reflects more genuinely Al-Mufid's thought, I would opt for the second, demythologizing explanation. But of course, the two versions may well have coexisted peacefully in this great scholar's mind. The tension between the commitment of Shi'i scholars to the transmitted word, that is Qur'an and Hadith, on the one hand, and the desire to think and write in accordance with the changing intellectual climate, brings us to the final part of tonight's lecture. Some remarks on the Safavid era. You may justifiably ask why I am jumping a few centuries forward to Safavid Iran. The short answer, and we could return to it later in the discussion, if you wish, is that in this period, mostly due to the need to Shi'itize the state and to the gradual dominance of the Akhbari school, the sources of Hadith returned to the center of the stage. The early compilations of Hadith are being copied, recopied, and distributed across the country. In addition, they become the focal point of thorough analysis, interpretation, classification, and rearrangement. In many aspects, the Akhbaris would like to see themselves as reviving the pre-rationalist era of Shi'i scholarship. Yet, at least 6 centuries elapsed since the time of Shaykh al-Saduq, perhaps the last major representative of the Qummi traditionalist conservative school, until the 17th century. Scholars of the Safavid era have read Ibn Sina, Al-Ghazali, Suhrawardi, Ibn Arabi, and many others. They cannot and wish not ignore centuries-long progress of Islamic sciences and thought. Their reading of the Quran and the Hadith is thus inevitably reflective of their zeitgeist. The amount of works dedicated to the Quran and the Hadith in the Safavid era is overwhelming, and here too I am only at the initial stages of familiarizing myself with it. Around the concept of pre-existence alone, one finds oneself in front of an ocean of information. To give you just a taste of it, I will limit myself to 2 or 3 scholars whose views on the myth of pre-existence, or on the narrative around which the myth evolved in connection with the covenant verse, are particularly indicative of the intellectual climate. In the early 17th century, Muhammad Amin al-Astarabadi, known as the founder of the Akhbariyya, wrote a commentary, Hashia, on Al-Kulayni's celebrated compilation of Hadith al-Kafi. Unlike al-Mufid, al-Astarabadi embraces the idea of a primordial pre-existential covenant due to which humans are inherently bound to acknowledge their creator. He calls this the first taklif, or imposition of religious duties. From traditions that elaborate on this idea, he concludes that this first taklif occurred twice, once in an entirely abstract world and once in the world of the Dhar. As for the world of the Dhar, he explains, on that day, the souls were attached to a tiny body, jism saghir, as small as ant. Clearly, one understands he believes that already at this stage there were souls that could be attached to tiny bodies. As for the entirely abstract world, the Imam's traditions, he says, refer to the abstract essence or quiddity, jawhar, that will in the future be attached to bodies as shadows, dhilla, because people's minds were unable to grasp an entirely abstract concept. He is then at ease with souls being attached to tiny bodies, but prefers to understand shadows metaphorically. A few decades later, in the middle of the same century, Muhammad Salih al-Mazandarani, who equally struggles to understand what the Imams meant by Dhar and whether it represents a different pre-existential state than that of the shadows, suggests to understand shadows as referring to the same tiny bodies of the world of the Dhar that were mentioned by al-Astarabadi. In comparison to the bodies of our world, these tiny bodies, al-Mazandarani says, could actually be seen as mere shadows. Towards the end of the century, another eminent scholar, Faid Kashani, died in 1691 CE, takes us in his commentary on the covenant verse even deeper into the world of metaphysics. According to him, this verse refers to God spreading in front of his knowledge the essences, haqa'iq, of all generations to come. He then addresses them in languages appropriate to the various degrees of preparedness of each essence, istidad. This should not be understood as speaking, Kashani specifies, but rather as a metaphor expressing this meaning. The entire scenario, according to him, took place in a non-tangible cognitive existence, in which the Dhar, being then an image of light in God's mind, could hear God's question, Alastu bi Rabbikum, am I not your Lord, due to the cognitive abilities God bestowed upon them. Accordingly, the Dhar replied in languages appropriate to this phase. Towards the end of the discussion, Kashani concludes that the possibility that they spoke in the language of Malakut, or the language of Alam al-Mithal, Mundus Imaginalis, which is different than the world of the intellect, could not be ruled out. We can clearly see here the traces of theosophical theories that locate an intermediate world, imaginal one, sometimes also called barzakh, between the tangible world and the world of pure intellect. A similar message is conveyed by Kashani in his voluminous Hadith compilation Al-Wafi. Kashani further articulates his views on the subject not only in reference to the covenant verse, in another work of more philosophical character titled Al-Kalimat al-Maknuna. As showed meticulously a few years ago by Mathieu Terrier, in Al-Kalimat al-Maknuna, Kashani draws a distinction between the prehistory of the souls of the prophets and the imams and between the history of the souls of the rest of mankind. If with regard to the prophets and the imams, he adheres to a certain variation of the Platonist notion of the soul's pre-existence, in the case of the rest of mankind, he resorts to the Aristotelian view according to which the souls come into being simultaneously with the bodies. This distinction, I would argue, is the result of an attempt to reconcile rationalism with the undeniable mythic depictions of the Prophet and the Imams in the Hadith. I'm coming to my conclusion now, which is very short. So I hope that I was able to cast some light on the importance of what I see alongside this world, dunya, and the hereafter, al-akhirah, as a third fundamental dimension of Shi'i thought, that of pre-existence. And I would like to conclude this lecture on a personal note. Pre-existence in Shi'i thought was among the many topics that I used to discuss on a regular basis with Yanis Eshet, a dear friend of mine and an exceptionally gifted scholar. As many of you know, Yanis, who was a research associate here at the Institute and professor at the Department of Asian Studies at the University of Latvia, passed away unexpectedly roughly a year ago. This happened very shortly after he went through the last proofs of his book, Patterns of Thought in Safavid Iran, the Philosophical School of Isfahan and the Gnostic of Shiraz, that was launched here several weeks ago. Of relevance to today's lecture is Yanis's elaboration, mainly in the chapter devoted to the life, works, and philosophical doctrine of Mir Damad, on the concept of time in general, and on the relation of the world of time and becoming to the world of eternity in particular. In many ways, this lecture is dedicated to him. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Roy, for this great lecture. I'm sure I have some comments and questions, but I will leave the floor to Edmund Hayes first.
Thank you very much, Roy. That was really fascinating, and I learned a lot. I should first preface my remarks by saying that I'm primarily personally a social historian. I'm using a lot of the same texts that you use, but reading them against the grain to try and look at the social world, whereas you, I think, probably on the whole, are reading them as they're meant to be read, more the Hadith, in the sense that you're trying to understand the core idea that the Hadith are trying to purvey. So some of what I'm going to say may be in that sense against the grain, or off what your major interests are. And I guess so. You've covered a lot of time. So I'm going to start as well, follow more or less your chronological progression in my questions. And the first sort of chronological chunk that you were talking about is the pre-Islamic Greek late antique inheritance. And then you move into the Hadith of the Imam. So
Through the Qur'an.
And through the Qur'an, yeah. So I'm going to... So that clearly you have this sense that the Hadith of the Imams reflect not just an engagement with the Quran, but also a larger intellectual world, the inheritance of late antiquity. And this is perhaps an impossible question, but my first question is, what is the route that you see that transmission happening? Is this a study circles, the discussions around the water cooler of 8th and 9th century Iraq? Is there a formal level of transition? Is it, you mentioned the translation of Plotinus, or the Praise of Plotinus. What are the kinds of, and I guess it's nice to do this in an oral context because you don't have to write it down and footnote it. But I'd like to hear more or less your sense of what the roots there are and how we can think about it.
Well, you get directly to the smoking gun question. And I don't think personally that there is one. I have the tendency to see ideas as floating in the air. If you're in the intellectual, if you're part of an intellectual world, you observe ideas not necessarily through a direct source. This is my personal feeling. Now, if we try really to trace the origins of Shi'i Hadith, then many questions come up. Personally, I do not know how many of the Hadiths we can actually trace back to the Imams that are said to have said them. There are different views with regard to this question. But if at least some of the Hadiths that are ascribed, for example, as you know, most of the Hadith corpus is ascribed to the 6th Imam, Ja'far al-Sadiq, and he died at 765. which is the early Abbasid period, just after the revolution, the Abbasid revolution, and I'm not sure whether the translation project of the Abbasid period started then, maybe it was just the beginning. So, but these, as you are well aware of it, and as you mentioned, are veins that I'm less personally attracted to search for a concrete source of inspiration or influence. I always remember Angelika Neuwirth's book on the Qur'an of late antiquity. I see the Hadith as the Hadith of late antiquity as something that, no matter how we turn it, reflects the intellectual climate at the time of its composition, whether it was really this or that Imam, or whether the disciples and the Hadith scholars ascribed several ideas to their Imams. At any rate, it reflects, in my view, the zeitgeist, like I said.
Yeah, thank you. Well, that leads directly into a follow-up question I had is, what is the, so you mentioned some of the different conceptions and the different languages that we have in the Hadith, the Imams relating these pre-existent souls, in particular, but the ashbah, the shadows, and the other elements. To what extent do you see a contradiction in this material, and to what extent do contradictions imply different hermeneutic communities? Can you trace subcorpora that you can say this is a smaller, coherent subset of this larger idea, and so would that help us to reconstruct schools of thought, areas of debate in the community?
Well, contradictions are inseparable from the Hadith, as you know, and actually, specifically with regard to the processes that have brought the world into its current state, let's say, familiar history of mankind. So there are many contradictions, and personally, I still, until today, did not manage to put some order into these contradictions and to make sense of them. I always go back to Vilozny's writings on the subject, and I think that in some of his articles he tries to arrange a little bit the chaos that we find with respect to these worlds. But personally, I still cannot really figure out what came after what, whether these contradictions are. You saw that in the Safavid era, scholars that try to comment on or interpret these traditions have the same difficulties to arrange the things according to some rational logic, chronology, and I think that even among themselves they are not consensus with regard to the order of things and how to explain certain contradictions. So, as you said in the beginning of your things, I think that in my work I'm trying to give voice to this difficulty, to these contradictions. I'm not coming to solve them and to say this aspect contradicts another. This must be an expression for a different school of thought. It could be that sometimes this is the case if you trace the disciples to whom certain views are ascribed, and you say that this guy belongs to the Ulat. This explains why he uses, for example, al-ashbah, which is a concept that we know from Shi'i currents that are non-Imami, Ulat, and then later other Shi'i trends. Yeah, but again, I'm fascinated enough by the ideas that these texts express, and I don't feel obliged to make sense of everything.
Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense. And so the way that you describe the sort of question and answer format with it was very interesting. In particular, the hadith where you mentioned that the followers asked the Imam rather naive questions about something that they already knew, a basic paradigm, a basic idea of this pre-existence format, and then the Imam was very clear in then laying out the exact, more specific details. So that sounded like this was a rhetorical strategy within the hadith that represents itself as the authority of the Imam, and his followers really need him. Yes. And so that's not just answering a question, it's also creating this image of authority. It also perhaps it sort of raised the question in my mind, to what extent are these hadith also allow us to understand what the reading strategies are of people at the time. And because I think a lot of your talk was about sort of different reading strategies of the Quranic material, and then the hadith that interprets the Quranic material, and then the later reading of both Quran and hadith. So do we see any reading strategies for the difficulties in the hadith themselves? And to what extent is there a continuum there with this sort of a moment that you very nicely laid out with Ibn Babawayh, Sheikh Saduq, and the criticism of his approach?
If I understood correctly what you're asking, so you're referring to the fact that different Shi'i scholars approach their own sources in different angles, different attitudes.
And so, do we see in the hadith themselves, are there evidence of methods of reading hadith, methods of interpreting the Imam's words, or are they just a rhetorical strategy that shows us an image of Imamic authority?
Well, again, this goes back to the question of whether these hadith reflect something authentic, an encounter between a disciple or a follower and an Imam, or whether they were constructed either by the Imams themselves or by the community that adhered to these Imams in order to achieve certain, let's say, theological goals. But I know that the Shi'i community itself was, maybe until today, was preoccupied with how are we to address contradictions within our own sources. And I mentioned that Al-Mufid blames the hadiths that describe the souls as speaking entities as hadith al-ahad, that is hadiths that could not be trusted or adopted. On the other hand, we have a lot of chapters in hadith books that are titled Bab Ikhtilaf al-Hadith. What do we do with traditions that contradict each other? And one of the common Imami-Shi'i answers to these contradictions is, of course, taqiyya, yes? An Imam can answer the same question in two different, or at least in two different, sometimes in two opposite ways, due to circumstances of taqiyya. But this is approaching the question from a very Shi'i point of view. You cannot just accept it that an Imam would say a thing and it's opposite without some explanation. But I guess each of us experiences this, and especially when such a huge amount of material is being collected and disseminated. Contradictions are inevitable, especially in medieval times. Today, let alone in medieval times. So definitely, the question is relevant within the community, I think. The thing about hadith is a rhetorical means to. This is an interesting thing, because many of the hadiths I read, I feel that they were really constructed in a very sometimes symmetric way, sometimes question answered. The question, it's like sometimes the question is invited questions by the Imam, and the Imam can say to one of his disciples, "Do you know what that and that means?" Of course, the disciple never, or very often, doesn't know, and then comes the answer. So, this pattern of transmitting knowledge through Q&A is familiar also from the Persian literature, from Jewish literature. How authentic questions and the answers are, it's a question of your field of research, I guess, more than mine. I really don't go there in my
Sure.
But
I guess though we can see similar reading strategies over time, that these, you mentioned sort of harmonization and criticism, the ahad, and I guess interpretations. These are three broad reading strategies that seem to be, from what you're saying, transhistorical, though with the Safavid material you have a much more, the philosophical, the Aristotelian, Platonic stuff is really much more visible.
Yeah.
Well, finally, just one last thing is, before I cede the floor, is to what extent do we have here a struggle over orthodoxy? That these people are trying to construct an orthodoxy about this. This is our myth. The i'tiqadat seems to be doing that. Does this continue to be something that is a fundamental concern of this is the Imam, this is 12 orthodoxy, or is this just one question among many that is open to debate?
Well, this is definitely one question among many that is, as I said when I referred to especially the Kitab al-Mufiid, he does not accept many of the articles of faith that Saduq, but just a generation earlier tried to define, and the soul's pre-existence is just one of them. And this is in both cases, Saduq and al-Mufiid, we are in relatively early after the Imam's greater occultation, and things are not yet crystallized, they are not yet well defined, and this is the Buwayhid period which is so important for the, let's say, defining to ourselves, the Shia, what we believe in, and then comes into this equation the tension between the rationalism and the traditionalism, which is part of Shia for generations until today, with the peaks along the history, especially in the Safavid era between the Akhbariya and the Usuliya, but we see this tension very early on in Shiism. This debate between al-Mufiid and Saduq is a good example for this, although one does not refer to the other as Akhbari and I'm Usuli, but the later Akhbariya would refer to Saduq as original Akhbari, and to al-Mufiid as someone who started to deviate from the right path, until later Al-Alam al-Hilli and others even ruined entirely the structure of the edifice.
Yeah.
It was built by the early community of Imams, followers, etc., and loyal traditionists. This is what makes reading Shi'i sources so interesting, that it's not just one-sided story.
And very nice. I feel it's very fruitful to do, as you've been doing, and trace one idea or set of ideas through these.
This is actually my first, probably maybe one of the first experiences that I do along these lines, taking an idea and tracing it through Imami literature from the earliest we have until I stopped this time at the late Safavid period, but you could go on and search more how these ideas are being approached by modern scholars. Tabatabai's commentary of the Quran is very fruitful. So now I remember that I did examine some things that he said about another matter. So it's really interesting. And you see that every generation, alongside the commitment to the Quran, the Hadith, things are being approached from another angle. Previous views are debated. Scholars build upon them, they contradict them, they go further.
Thank you. Thank you, Ed. I had a few comments and questions. Well, maybe I'll start with the last question that asked you in relation to the construction of orthodoxy. So, if al-Mufid represents the construction of the rationalistic Shi'i view, can we say that Ibn Nawawi himself was also engaged in a similar process of the construction of a Shi'i identity against other Shias, namely the Ghulat? So do you see that in your analysis of his pre-existence hadith? Are there allusions to this?
Definitely. I mentioned that the accusation of al-Mufid, that the view of al-Saduq with regard to the pre-existence of the souls is actually the view of the Tanasukhiya, yes? And Tanasukh is one, or the metempsychosis is one of the beliefs that are ascribed by Imamis to the Ghulat. Definitely, Saduq does not see himself as one who believes in the transmigration of the soul. And I think that in one of his treatises, he even declares anyone who ascribes to us the Imamiyya, the belief in the transmigration of the soul, is a liar. Yes, so of course he is also trying to differentiate his view of Imamiyya or Imami views from other currents. But the problem is that we have limited sources. Moshe words on the views of the Ghulat, not through the lens of the Imamiyya.
Yeah.
And I look at it more from the Imami lens. I many times see this as evolutional struggle or survival. The views that are somehow that gain popularity, they survive. They are transmitted further. The books are copied, and the books that are and the views that are not really catchy, they are lost on the way, and we have references to them.
But I mean, would you say that when he talks about this theme, is he replying to these Tanasukhiya? Is he trying to,
For sure, he's trying. One of the motivation to write a book called I'tiqādat al-Imamiyya is to say, here is who we are, here is what we stand for. Don't mix us with any other. It's strange that his disciple, al-Mufid, uses him for the very same thing that he was trying to clear himself from.
Yeah. But, so his attempt is one of preserving this myth. What he does is attempting to preserve the myth as a part of the Shi'i doctrine, but not the metempsychosis doctrine.
Yes.
Which is interesting because Paul Walker, in an article entitled The Doctrine of Metempsychosis in Islam, so he talks mostly about these discussions in philosophical circles, but one of the main points of the article is that whenever you posit pre-existence, then potentially you pave the way to doctrine of metempsychosis. And he thus explains that Ibn Sina's doctrine was that souls are created at the same time as the bodies, and when they die, the body dies, the soul survives, but it doesn't pre-exist the body, which is a very unbalanced doctrine, right? But the reason why Ibn Sina rejects pre-existence is because he rejects Tanasuf.
Yes, I know that also in the Christian world, this belief is often associated with the belief in pre-existence of the soul.
Yes.
It was associated with the belief in transformation of the soul. I'm not aware of Ibn Sina's conception of social. I noted it down, but you are aware of the fact that certain thinkers have reached the conclusion, Plato, I think, souls must pre-exist because of the contradiction of life and death, and something that is alive must have been dead before, and something that dies must have been alive before. It's like a circle of antonyms.
But so, I mean, it's interesting that the Imami-Shiʿi would preserve this whole pre-existence myth, apparently knowing that potentially it could lead to Tanasukhism.
Yeah, it's true. Many go through Imami ideas and beliefs, you may trace them back to some currents that were shared as relat by the Imams themselves.
Yeah.
They took the idea, and but maybe your last remark shows that just in even Buwayhid's time, he does not see himself as a rationalist scholar who has to find a rationalist way to defend the Imamiyya from this accusation of Tanasukhiyya. He is more obliged or obligated to the words of the Imams, the Qur'an, and he stops somewhere. Then is a disciple, and if it goes further, and then he sees that rationally you cannot really adhere to pre-existence without being somehow similar to those who believe in the transformation of the soul. But even my wife stops before he gets there, and it's like it represents. I see even Babai as a person who has one leg in the traditional world of but his other leg is already in the rationalist world, but he doesn't cross entirely the line. His disciple did it, but even he, you see, I quoted one of his interpretation to the verse of the covenant that he accepts as valid. God spreading the dove as all over the horizons. They have no active role or anything like that, but still, it doesn't exclude entirely mythic narratives. Yes. And then I asked him during the lecture whether how could we hear, on the one hand, a very rationalist explanation to this verse of the same person in the field, that the covenant that is achieved or being done between God and every mukallaf by giving us human beings aql, reason or intelligence, and proofs within the created world. On the one hand, this is very rationalist. You don't feel there very mystic tone, subtones. And at the same time, God took the offspring of Adam as the children of Adam as dove and spread them. So with regard to the Imams, if Al-Mufid was an Imam, we would probably see these views under a chapter Bab Ikhtilaf al-Hadith. But he is a scholar, he's not an Imam, but nevertheless, the things that coexist in his mind, I would say that one necessarily cancels the other. There must be some rational explanation for his expression of two different views. Yeah.
Yes, because we were talking in these mythical narratives, they're present in much more detail in the Qur'an literature that you mentioned. That Sheikh Al-Asafriyan worked on, so the Haftil al-Azilla, the Ashbah wal-Azilla, and so forth. So are these texts, I mean, have you looked into these texts? What is their relationship with material you find in 12-verse Shi'i sources? Is the 12-verse Shi'i version just an attenuated form of these very complex Ghulat cosmogonies, or is it something else?
It's a good question. I cannot really answer in detail because I haven't compared the narrative that we find in Al-Kashf, for example, with the narrative within. This is a very good direction, I think. But then again, you see the Ghulat ceased to exist as Ghulat. Some Shia, the surviving manifestations of Shiism do not include Ghulat, but see themselves as Ghulat, and they are seen by others. So imagine that a certain carrier of Double Kashf would
have to.
Kitab al-Hafth would this would be transmitted within a community as a book. I think that another scholar might address it in the same way that Al-Mufid addresses the narratives that reached him through his.
Well, thank you all, and thank you to you, Roy, for your stimulating presentation, and thank you, Edmund, for agreeing to participate in this session. Thank you all for attending. After the summer break and up until December, we will have 3 more lectures in the series. Only one will be in person. That will be on the 8th of December with Professor Leonardo Capezone from the Sapienza University in Rome. And so all these lectures will be announced soon on the IAS website. Thank you again for your attendance.